The coronavirus pandemic has spawned its own epidemic of disinformation. Social media is awash with it, emanating from the political fringes and even from those at the center of power.
You turn on CNN, that's all they cover. COVID, COVID, pandemic, COVID, COVID, COVID. You know why? They're trying to talk everybody out of voting. People aren't buying at CNN, you dumb bastards. They're not buying it. That's all they talk about.
Many governments and medical organizations are waging a secondary war against misinformation and deliberate disinformation. But some countries are using claims of disinformation as an excuse for suppressing legitimate reporting and to suppress the spread of accurate information domestically and abroad. They're using the pandemic to ramp up censorship and secrecy legislation. That's having a chilling effect on journalists and the spread of information. And accurate, timely information is essential to saving lives. Welcome to our COVID-19 special here on DW News. I'm Monica Jones in Berlin. Good to have you with us. It is the job of journalists to uncover facts and share them with the public. But what if those facts don't support the official line? A democracy should be able to handle that. But now, during the pandemic, some governments think otherwise. And that often puts journalists and public health at risk.
Behind the mask of coronavirus, censorship spreads. Journalists around the world have come under attack for reporting on the pandemic. It started in China, where citizen journalists dared to deviate from the official narrative. Cheng Shixue shared images of overstretched hospitals in Wuhan.
The virus is right in front of me. China's criminal prosecutors are behind me. I'm not afraid of death. Do you think I'm afraid of you, Communist Party of China?
Cheng Shixue disappeared in February and was only seen again by friends in September. Fang Bin, another reporter, remains missing. He had released secret videos of coronavirus victims. Reporters Without Borders has documented coronavirus coverage restrictions in nearly half of all UN member states. Those who are jailed are at risk of infection. Al Jazeera journalist Mohamed Monir died in July from coronavirus after being arrested in Egypt, as did reporter Saleh Al-Sheikh, jailed for documenting corruption in Saudi Arabia. The deliberate targeting of the press has worried the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner.
Across the world, COVID-19 is also being instrumentalized to limit people's rights to speak, to express opinion, and to participate in making decisions that affect their lives. In the Russian Federation, China, Kosovo, Nicaragua, and many other countries, I note reports of threats and intimidation against journalists, bloggers, and civic activists, particularly at the local level, with the apparent aim of discouraging criticism of the authorities' responses to COVID-19.
At a time when information can save lives, press repression can fuel the pandemic.
And I'm joined now by Ali Funk, a senior research analyst for technology and democracy at Freedom House. Good to have you with us. Your Freedom on the Net report states that the pandemic is fueling digital repression worldwide. How does that work?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So Freedom House found that 2020 was the 10th consecutive year of decline in internet freedom. And this is at a time when the pandemic has really accelerated our reliance on digital technologies. So what we found is that governments around the world have imposed broad restrictions to free expression and access to information. Political leaders are using the pandemic to scapegoat ethnic and religious groups, censor unfavorable news, and arrest critics. So, in at least 45 of the countries that we studied, we found that activists, journalists, and members of the public were arrested or charged with criminal offenses for their speech relating to COVID-19. And then we found that governments in at least 28 countries censored websites or social media posts to suppress unfavorable health statistics and corruption allegations. And then we also found that there's been increased surveillance around the world. They've been using the pandemic as a cover to expand data collection.
Right. I mean, we've also, on the other side, seen a lot of protests, more and more protests against coronavirus pandemic measures. I mean, how do you differentiate between authorities using COVID-19 to curb freedom of speech and those genuinely trying to flatten the curve?
It's a great question. I mean, during times of crisis, certain restrictions to freedoms can be justified. These restrictions just need to be grounded in law. They have to be the least intrusive as possible and include independent oversight. But restrictions to press freedom and free expression really only undermine government's ability to contain the virus. As we've mentioned, information can be the difference between life and death. Restrictions to free speech limit people's ability to access accurate information to keep themselves safe. And then in order for people to be willing to take these drastic measures, such as closing their shops, staying at home, not going to school, it's really important that they trust their elected leaders. And government officials can only gain this trust by being transparent and keeping a free and open information environment.
Right. And of course, what you mentioned, very important, accurate information. Now, the internet, social media certainly is sadly a perfect breeding ground for fake news and conspiracy theories, especially now during the pandemic, we've seen that. How can journalists help expose those lies without putting themselves at risk?
You're right. Our research has shown that there's been a concerted strategy by state officials and their supporters to promote these conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, that really aligns with their nationalistic or xenophobic goals. So what journalists can do, it's more important than ever that we expose these disinformation campaigns, including where they're coming from. To stay safe, really, they can use encrypted communication platforms such as Signal to stay safe from government censorship. Virtual private networks are going to be really important to be able to continue their reporting. And it's really through this reporting, now more than ever, journalists and their work are more important. It's a life and death issue.
Now, you mentioned it in one of your previous answers, and many studies certainly agree with you, namely that COVID-19 is pushing digital technologies, AI, the internet. What needs to be done to use this development to promote freedom of speech and democracy?
So you're right. We're really sleepwalking into a world in which our most sensitive personal and biometric data, our face, our fingerprints, are going to be at the mercy of private companies and state agencies. So that's why Freedom House is actually calling for a freeze on the use of biometric surveillance, such as facial recognition, until we know how these new technologies really affect human rights and democracy. Any new surveillance programs around COVID-19 also need strict safeguards. We need to prove first that they're even effective in limiting disease spread. And then if public health experts agree that they are, we need to ensure that data is deleted after the pandemic, there's independent oversight, and also that any program is transparent. And that's really the only way, and it's going to take collective global action to ensure that the pandemic doesn't create a long-term deterioration in internet freedom and the human rights of privacy and free expression.
All right, Ellie Funk there from Freedom House joining us in New York. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, sometimes even the experts don't agree, and that's making it harder for us laymen to grasp complex issues. Luckily, we have our very own scientific correspondent to turn to. Time to ask Derek.
What are the risks of the focused protection approach laid out in the Great Barrington Declaration?
Since the very earliest days of this pandemic, there have been those who believe that our responses to COVID-19, so the lockdowns and all the other measures, that they have actually caused more damage than the disease itself. And they believe that we need to look for other options even without access to a vaccine, since really wide-scale infection would be, at least theoretically, a pathway to what we want, which is herd immunity. The concept laid out in the highly controversial declaration that you mentioned was proposed several weeks ago by 3 scientists from the US and Britain, and it's been signed by others. It says that we need to only focus on protecting groups that it classifies as vulnerable, especially the elderly, and it urges a return to normal life immediately for everyone else. That means basically not trying to limit infections among those that it says are at minimal risk of death. So what would be the dangers of going down that path? There are some pretty major ones. A big flaw in the Declaration's reasoning, a lot of experts say, is the fundamental assumption that people who appear to gain at least some immunity after surviving the disease will keep that immunity for extended periods. We've already seen some cases of people who have gotten COVID-19 a second time, though so far they've thankfully been few and far between. Still, the coming months could see many, many more. Another big question, how exactly would you go about protecting vulnerable populations effectively in societies where the virus is basically raging unchecked? Is that even possible? And an aspect that the Declaration doesn't address at all is the potential long-term damage that COVID-19 could do to many younger people, even those who survive. Then, of course, at least some people who aren't classified as vulnerable will turn out to be very vulnerable to COVID-19 after all, and they'll die from it. Potentially even millions of people worldwide, people who wouldn't have died if social distancing measures remained in force until effective vaccines are available.